Let's go over what we're making today. We're going to be building a Star Wars RPG game using jQuery. Here's how the app works. When the game starts, the player will choose a character by clicking on the fighter's picture. The player will fight as that character for the rest of the game. So here I'm going to choose Obi-Wan Kenobi. The player must then defeat all of the remaining fighters. Enemies should be moved to a different area of the screen. I've chosen Obi-Wan Kenobi, and all of the enemies have moved over to the enemies available to attack section. I choose an opponent by clicking on an enemy's picture. Here I'm going to start with fighting Luke Skywalker. Once the player selects an opponent, that enemy is moved to a defender area. So there he is in the defender section. The player will now be able to click the attack button right here. Whenever the player clicks attack, their character damages the defender. The opponent will lose HP. These points are displayed at the bottom of the defender's picture. The opponent character will instantly counter the attack. When that happens, the player's character will lose some of their HP. These points are shown at the bottom of the player character's picture. The player will keep hitting the attack button in an effort to defeat their opponent. When the defender's HP is reduced to 0 or below, remove the enemy from the defender area. The player character can now choose a new opponent. Now I can choose to fight Darth Sidious. I'm going to choose to fight again. Awesome. The player wins the game by defeating all enemy characters. The player loses the game if their character's HP falls to 0 or below. Awesome, so I've won with 10 HP left. And I still have a restart button, so I can restart the game and play as another character. Let's talk about the Homework 4 challenge. I'm going to start by opening up command line and setting up the folder structure. We're going to create an index.html and an assets folder. Inside the assets folder, we're going to create 3 additional folders: CSS, JavaScript, and images. We're doing this namely for organization. This way we know where we need to go if we need to change the way something looks or if we need to change the logic. Next, we're going to create the files in each folder. In CSS, we're going to create a style.css, and in the JavaScript folder, we're going to create rpg-starwars.js. Now that we have all the files, we're going to make sure that everything's there. And I'm going to take the entire folder and drop it in Sublime. Let's open index.html and start coding. I'm going to use the Sublime shortcut to set up the basic structure for HTML. The title will be Star Wars with jQuery. Now we're going to import the CSS and JavaScript files that we created earlier. The href and source are relative paths. This is in relation to the index.html file. In the case of the CSS, we will be going to the assets folder, which exists in the same path as the index.html. Then CSS, and we'll find style.css. Same with the JavaScript file. The assets folder exists in the same path as the index.html. Then JavaScript and rpg-starwars.js. Let's build the body of the HTML now. At this point, it's good to have an idea of what the final product should look like. In most cases, we'll be referencing a mockup, but in this case, we'll be looking at the actual finished page. I see a title section and a main game area. In the main game section, I see the character selection, my selected character, enemy section, fight section, and a defender section. I also need to add messages so I know what is going on in the game. This can be added outside of the main game section. Let's get to it then. I'm going to start by creating the 3 divs, one for the title, one for the main game section, and one for the messages. We're going to create the character selection div, the selected character div, available to attack div, the attack section, the fight section, and the action section inside of the main game div. Let's see how this looks so far. Alright, so it looks like it needs some styling now. So we'll open up the style.css. Let's start by making the section titles bigger. Save and reload the page. I don't see any changes. I'm going to check index.html and make sure that everything is linked properly. I kind of noticed that I've made a couple of mistakes here. First of all, it should be link rel equals style sheet, and I should spell style sheet properly actually. Refresh the page, and voila, it works. Let's make the main section title font size bigger than the section title font sizes. Refresh the page, it's bigger. Let's center align it now. So far this looks pretty good. Let's add a background image though. Usually we're gonna have to find all the pictures, but I already have all the images, so I'm just gonna move them into the images folder in the assets folder. Now I'm gonna add that to the body. Notice how I did / images? Well, that's because we're going from the CSS folder here, we're going up a directory into the images, then we have all the pictures here. I'm going to refresh the page and make sure it worked. Awesome. This looks kind of weird. I'm going to see what it looks like full screen. It looks much better full screen, but I don't think it's quite center aligned yet. Okay, this is a little odd. Now it's repeating. I'm going to get rid of that as well. Alright, now we've got this white spot underneath. I think we can change that by doing a background attachment and fixing it. Alright, that looks much better, and if we zoom in or zoom out, it still stays the same and in the middle. That's great. Alright, now I'm going to try to make this look a little prettier by changing the font. I'm going to go to fonts.google.com. Here I'm going to look for a tech font, and I see Share Tech Mono. I like this one, so I'm going to take it. I'm going to click on select this font, and I'm going to copy this HTML code into my HTML. I'm going to paste it in above the CSS because I'm going to need to access it from the CSS file. Next, we're going to go to the CSS and change the font family. Let's take a look. It looks great. Let's add a couple more fonts in case that this font doesn't actually get reached. These are just fonts in case any of the other ones aren't available. Now that we have the general look of the page setup, let's add some functionality. I'm going to start by adding jQuery for DOM manipulation. DOM stands for Document Object Model, and it defines the HTML elements as objects. There are multiple ways of getting the jQuery files, but I'm just going to copy paste the link I find for the latest minified version found at code.jquery.com. You can also choose to download the jQuery files into your CSS folder and link it that way. I'm going to link the jQuery above the JavaScript file because in the JavaScript file I'm going to be using jQuery. If the jQuery is loaded after the JavaScript file, we will get errors about unknown methods and the functions won't work as expected, if at all. We need to always remember that the page is loaded from top to bottom. I'm going to console log characters and make sure that everything is loading properly and I don't have any syntax errors. This is also good to see what is happening. Here we can see that the objects and all of their properties have in fact loaded. Let's render these objects to the page now so that we can actually see and interact with them. I'm going to create a versatile function for rendering characters to a target section. The versatility will keep my code minimal so that I don't have to create a new function to render the characters in a different section. I can recycle my already existing one. The function parameters will include the character or characters to be rendered in the target section ID as a string. Because I'm declaring this function as a variable, whenever I make a function call, it must be made after the declaration of the function variable. If the function is called before the variable is declared, the page won't know what you're talking about. Let's create an if statement to declare the condition of the area render. Area render is the target section. This if statement is the key to the versatility of the function. For now, the if statement condition will check to see if we are targeting the characters section. This statement means that it will loop through the properties of the object, and at each pass, the variable key will represent the property. I'm going to add another if statement to make sure that the object is not empty. Once this condition is met, I want to render a div for every object in the characters object. In this case, it will be Obi-Wan, Luke Skywalker, Darth Sidious, and Darth Maul. I'm going to create a function for this because rendering a div to a target section is going to be something that we use multiple times. I'm going to call this render1. Render1 needs to be above render characters because it must be declared before it can be called. The parameters are going to be character object to be rendered and the target location. Here we're going to create divs using jQuery. The data name for the char div will be based on the character object's name property. For example, if we're creating a div for Obi-Wan, the data name property for the div will be Obi-Wan Kenobi. It will inherit this value from the Obi-Wan Kenobi object from the characters object. Let's look at this visually. This is the characters object that we console logged. The value of the name property of the Obi-Wan Kenobi object will be set as the data name property for the div. Here we need to be careful to use single quotes and double quotes. I'm going to have to close this double quote in order to add the character.name. The char name variable is the name tag displayed at the top of the div. Char image is the image to be displayed in the object. Char health is the health. Now we're going to chain appends. Appends add to the end. Everything will be appended to the char div, then the char div will be appended to the target location. Alright, let's check to see if everything worked. That's weird. Doesn't look like we got anything. That's because I forgot to actually make the render characters function call. We have the functions created, but we haven't actually called it. Let's do that now. That still didn't really work. Let's take a look at the console and see if we get any errors. Oh, I've made a spelling error. I forgot to capitalize R. This is in line 46. We can see that there. Let's try it now. Still getting issues. Character health is not defined. I must have forgotten to add that. Let's try adding that and try again. I'm going to refresh. Everything's good. It looks like everything's here. This is kind of ugly though. It's not quite like this. Let's add some CSS. First we want to line up all of the character divs. We'll do that by giving them an inline block. We'll add some borders as well to make it look cleaner. We're giving it a cursor pointer so that whenever you hover, it looks like you can actually select it. As for the character image, we're going to give it some padding and margin. Next, we're going to center align the name and health. These pictures are a little too big. We're going to change all of the picture sizes by targeting the image. We're going to give it a height, a width, and a border radius. That looks a lot better. It looks like we have a pretty functional page now, but when we click on these divs, nothing happens. Let's give it an on-click action. I'm also going to add some comments to separate the variable and function declarations from the rest of the code. Here, I'm going to console log just to show that a click does something. Let's refresh and try it. There it is. I'm going to create a variable called name, and it's going to be given the value of the data name attribute from the selected div. The keyword this refers to the DOM element that has been clicked. We are using this because we don't know what character the user will choose. This allows us to get information for whatever is clicked on. Let's console log to make sure that we are getting the results we are expecting. Let's make it so that when the user selects a character, the user can now play the game as that character. To do this, I'm going to start by creating a currently selected character variable. Then I'm going to create an if statement in the onClick function to make sure that there is no currently selected character. We will then loop through the remaining characters and push them to the enemy's array using the for variable in object loop we talked about earlier. In the if statement inside the for loop, we're making sure that the selected character does not get pushed into the enemies. We need to declare the combatants array that we are pushing to. Let's see if everything is working now. I'm going to console log the combatants array. This should list all the objects except for the one that we chose. We should now render the characters to their new sections and hide the character select div. We can reuse the render characters method we made earlier. We just need to add the if statements in there for each target section. Because in the selected character section we only need to add one div, we can just reuse the render one function we made earlier. In the available to attack section, we're going to use a for loop to render all of the objects in the array. Let's refresh the page and see what happens. When I select a character, oh, now we have a problem. Let's see what it is. It looks like we forgot to set the current selected character. Let's do that now. Let's see what happens when we refresh the page and try again. And now it worked. We actually need to give these new divs a class. That way, when we choose an enemy to fight, we can add an onClick to move them to the defenders and identify which characters are still available to attack. I'm going to do this by adding another parameter to the render1 function. The parameter is going to be char status, and I'm going to add an if statement to check what the status is before adding the class. This means that I'm going to have to find all of the other cases where I've called render1 and add an empty string into the argument. Let's refresh the page and make sure everything is still working so we know that we didn't miss anything. It looks like everything is working as expected. We're now going to create the onClick function for the enemy class so we can select an enemy to fight. It's the same concept as the previous onClick, but this time we are rendering to the defender div. We're going to add an if statement to check if there is already a defender. If there are none, we can render the selected defender. The reason we are putting it inside the if statement for the available to attack section is because we only need for this onClick to become available once we've populated the enemies section. Let's refresh the page and see what happens. Okay, we were able to select an enemy, but once we did so, they disappeared. I wonder what's going on. This is because we don't have an if for a defender ID. So what we're going to need to do is create another if statement for area render if the area render is equal to defender ID. Okay, a lot happened there. Let's break it down. We've created an if statement inside render characters for if the target area is defender. We first emptied the div to ensure that nothing is in there and we won't get different results. We then did a for loop to match the combatant that has the same name as the selected object as described by the onClick function above. Once we know what object we need to render in the defender section, we can use the render1 function and give the char status argument of defender. We will need an else if statement to match the parameter, and we are going to set a global variable current defender as the character object that was passed. We will then give the div a class of target enemy, so we know that the rendered div will be the targeted enemy. Let's make sure this works now. I'm going to refresh the page, select Obi-Wan, and Luke Skywalker. There he is. Now we can move on. We're now going to work on the attack function of the game. We're going to give the attack button some functionality on click. The first thing I'm going to do is add a turn counter variable that will update at the end of every attack. We're going to use the turn counter as a damage multiplier for our character's attack. If the defender div is not empty, we will reduce the defender's health by your attack value. This minus equal sign here is a shortcut for updating the variable on the left equal to the variable on the right subtracted from the variable on the left. We'll create an if statement to check to see if the defender has any health left after our attack. If the defender still has health remaining, we'll update the page to reflect the amount of health the defender has remaining. We're going to use the render characters function again, but this time our argument is going to be the string player damage. We'll create another if statement in the render characters function for player damage. We'll clear out the defender that's in there now, and we'll render the updated object. If we don't clear the div first, we'll end up with two divs there, one with the old amount of health and one with the updated amount of health. We can then update current selected character's health in the same manner, but this time we'll set the argument as enemy damage and create a similar if statement in render characters. The else statement is for if the defender has 0 health or less left. We want to remove the defender from play, so we'll use the render characters function again. We'll use the argument enemy defeated for the target render. The reason we are using the render characters function again instead of just clearing the div from the else statement is because if in the future we decide to add more functionality to our game, we can update all of the character renders in one location instead of looking for bits and pieces throughout the code. Back to the else statement in the attack button function. We need to be able to check to see if the game is over. We'll create a global variable for kill count and increment that whenever a defender runs out of health. Because we're going to have 3 enemies, we'll create an if statement to check if the kill count is 3 or more in case Obi-Wan kills too many drones. If the condition is met, we've won. The game should now be fully functional, but we have no way of knowing what has happened in the game just yet. What we're going to do now is create a render message function. We'll add these throughout the game so we know what's going on every step of the way. We're going to need to put the render message function above render characters because we're going to be making updates to the message section in render characters as things are happening. The render message function will only need to have one parameter. We'll call this message. We'll create a div for the message and append it to the game message section. We'll also create an if statement to see if the instruction is to clear the message section. Now we can go through and add messages where we think they should be. The final thing we have left is the restart game function. The restart game function will accept a parameter for what message to display at the end, whether it is a defeat or victory. We'll create a button with an onClick function to reload the page. We will create an endgame message at the end of the body, then append the button after that. If our current selected character drops to 0 or less health, or if we've successfully defeated all the enemies, we need to offer to restart the game. I had to move the else statement up because I had it set to be for if there were 0 defenders instead of if the defender had 0 health. That's it. We've completed our RPG game.